This is a response to Once Forgiven Now Free's video, The Living Dinosaur Gets Fossilized, itself a response to Holy Hallucinations 20. Unfortunately, Matt, rather than just sticking to addressing my criticisms, you decided to introduce a number of new points in your response. So in order to cover as much as I can, I'm going to have to take a slightly different tack in this video than I have in previous episodes, and I'm going to take a moment to clarify my position with respect to religion for the benefits of both yourself and my subscribers, and so I don't have to keep repeating myself later. You may have noticed that I'm an atheist. That is to say, I don't believe in any god or gods, and I do so because satisfactory empirical and verifiable evidence for their existence has never been presented to me. I'm also an agnostic because although at present I find the possibility unlikely, I can't honestly claim with certainty that a god or gods don't exist. I remain open to the presentation of new credible and objective evidence should it arise. I don't make videos against theism in general, partly because I think people are entitled to their beliefs as long as they don't force them onto others or try passing them off as fact, partly because I accept that I'm barely a layman in the areas of philosophy and theology, and partly because I realize that there are at present any number of ways to reconcile our understanding of the universe with theistic belief. I do, however, make anti-creationist videos because I am qualified to talk about science in general and biology in particular. I do so because while I'm tolerant of moderate theism, I find the behavior of fundamentalist scriptural literalists nothing short of repugnant. If they were to keep their ideas to themselves, that would be one thing, but when I see these beliefs being used to push political, social, and moral agendas onto others, I draw the line. In particular, I'll be fucked if I stand by and allow this laughably primitive bullshit to be fed to my children in science classes without doing my part to show it up for what it really is. So with all that said, there's a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. As you said yourself, your first 2 points were off topic, but I decided to dedicate some of my limited time to addressing them lest I be accused of being unable to do so. So let's take a look at what they were, shall we?
So the first thing that shocked me was your bluntness to the fact that there are moral obligations. As a Christian, I believe in the fall, where humankind fell from our intimate relationship with God. See, evolution attempts to describe the way things are. It says nothing about the way things ought to be. If everything is just molecules clashing together, how do you get moral obligations?
Aside from the fact that you seem to shock rather easily, I have to say that I was a little puzzled as to why you latched onto this seemingly innocuous comment rather than addressing more of my other points, such as what I know now to be the blatant quote mine at the end of your video. If you're trying to draw me away from the original topic and my area of expertise, Matt, it isn't going to work. As I said earlier, I'm a poor layman when it comes to philosophy, so I'm not going to debate it. Rather than making a fool of myself in public, I prefer to leave this subject to such sterling YouTubers as Michael Payton67 and Das American Atheist. But I do want to add that I am aware of the is-ought argument you mentioned and the fact that Theoretical Bullshit, undoubtedly my favorite YouTuber of all time, included it in his 3 recent incredible videos on morality. If you want to discuss it further, I suggest you try it with him. Just don't forget to strap a crash helmet to your ass before you do. Now, having said that, I'd still like to point out that were I to accept the argument from morality or any other philosophical construct for the existence of God, it would do nothing to prove the veracity of your religious views any more than it would anyone else's. How would the existence of objective moral values prove that your Bible was inerrant and that evolution was false? The answer is that it wouldn't, and the subject is completely irrelevant to the topics we're discussing. I'd also like to point out that just because I used the phrase moral obligation doesn't mean I should be expected to elaborate by explaining my entire belief system any more than my claiming that Nephilim Free as a wanker would require me to follow up by providing a concise summary of the joys and history of the five-knuckle shuffle. But since you asked, my use of the phrase was intended to be ironic. I find it personally distasteful in the extreme when I hear creationists whose religion supposedly imbues them with some kind of moral superiority telling the most outrageous lies about science, scientists, atheists, and pretty much anything else that counters their personal beliefs. If you want examples of the kind of Olympian-level dishonesty I'm referring to, then simply spend an hour or 2 watching some of my other videos. Just remember to keep a bucket handy.
So atheists will often mock Christians, saying that they don't understand evolution, and if they only understood it, then they would accept it. But here, you demonstrate that you don't understand the Bible. If you think the Bible is a pathetic little children's bedtime story, then that is one of the worst literary classifications I've ever heard of.
What you haven't appreciated, Matt, is that if I ever addressed moderate Christians, I wouldn't use the storybook line because they're not delusional enough to truly believe that the Bible is an accurate historical and scientific document. I use it with people like yourself who actually believe that the patently and verifiably obvious fables such as the Genesis account and the Noachian flood amongst many others are genuine reports of past events. It's in this respect that I call it a storybook, because in this respect it is a storybook. Though quite frankly, Harry Potter's more realistic, The Lord of the Rings is better written, and both are far more entertaining. And as for your claim for it being historically accurate, I'm also not going to be pulled into a theological discussion on the historicity of the Bible because again, it's not my field, and that's the kind of stuff that's best left to the marvelously entertaining and erudite Prof. MTH and his fellow ex-Christian It's the Superfly. If you should decide to ask them their opinions, then might I also suggest that you apply some superglue to that crash helmet to be sure it doesn't fall off.
What exactly indicates that nature is all there is? Are there some experiments that have indicated that the natural world is all there is? You claim that everything indicates that nature is all there is. Now, that's a very bold claim. So please provide only one piece of evidence that indicates that nature is all there is. That should be easy since, as you said, everything indicates that nature is all there is.
This really blew my mind, Matt. It really did. Now, to be fair, you preceded this by playing a clip from my video where I clearly say, at present everything happens to indicate that nature is all there is, since no evidence to support the existence of the supernatural in general and your special friend in particular has ever been forthcoming. And yet, despite that, you still managed to somehow completely ignore the second half of my sentence. These words that you neglected to take into account when you formulated your question, Matt, were placed there for a special purpose. They weren't puked up accidentally one morning by my word processor when I wasn't looking after it had spent a debauched night on my hard drive with a bottle of Jack Daniels and a sleazy spreadsheet it had picked up in virtual memory. Your question, therefore, Matt, is meaningless. My position is that every piece of repeatable, verifiable, empirical evidence generated in the history of science has indicated that the universe consists of a physical reality governed by natural laws. As I clearly stated, and you ignored, no such corresponding evidence has been generated to support the existence of the supernatural. If you want people to accept your beliefs, then the onus is on you to provide positive evidence to support them and not on me to prove a negative. And if you're thinking about turning around and saying that I'm being dishonest because I'm not accepting the possibility of the supernatural in the light that there's been no evidence to disprove it, then think again. Because I didn't use the word indicate for either decorative or aesthetic purposes, but to specify that the statement wasn't meant as a pronouncement of epistemic certainty, but of our current understanding based on the evidence before us. When or if the evidence changes, then so will my mind.
Do you not agree that the natural world is finite and that it had a beginning? Is that not pretty good evidence that there is something beyond the natural world? Since, the natural world didn't always exist?
Once again, Matt, you're trying to drag the debate into the area of philosophy, and I'm not going to bite. What I will say, though, is that at present it's unclear as to whether the natural world had a true beginning, whether the universe has always existed, or even whether it's just an infinitesimally small speck in an infinitely large multiverse. In other words, the jury's very much still out on this question, and the intellectually honest answer is I don't know. In addition, even if I conceded the point, and this would certainly not be pretty good evidence that there was something beyond the natural world, at best it would be an argument that this might be the case. I continue to find it astounding how creationists have such low standards for what they will consider as evidence in favor of their arguments, and yet happily dismiss mountains of empirical data that speak against them. Double standards, anybody?
You don't like my analogy because living things reproduce and change. And actually you went on a long rant about how living things change over time. First of all, no one disagrees with this. I can go to creation.com and learn all about how living things change, about how mutations work.
Matt. I'm not sure what made my jaw drop when I heard this. The fact that this is how you do your research, or that you didn't realize how bad admitting it would make you look. You're arguing against the science that proves that your worldview is wrong, Matt, so don't you think that it's incumbent on you to research what the science actually says? To read the actual papers? Examine the actual data? Apparently not, because you admitted that you get all your information from biased sources that have been shown to dishonestly misrepresent the science time and time again. Don't you think that it might have been more appropriate to learn how mutations work from a book on, say, genetics? Presumably, by this logic, if you needed to learn something about embryology, you'd find it reasonable to lock yourself in a bathroom for an hour with a copy of Playboy. You would be better served, Matt, by looking at the actual research you're disparaging and formulating some criticisms of your own instead of relying on some fucktard's concoction of quote mines and straw men. And if you don't, then you shouldn't be surprised if the smell rubs off on you. I'm finding it really hard not to get personal with you at this point, Matt, because this was just, well, pathetic. Really, really pathetic.
Creationists just believe that the variation is limited to the genetic variability built into the genome. That's why you can take a wolf and you can breed it into a dog, or say a poodle. However, you can't take a poodle and breed it back into a wolf. Why not? Because the information has been lost. It's no longer there. The genetic variability has been removed and that information has been lost. It's a one-way street downhill.
And this is what you get when you dredge up your information from the shit pits that you insist on frequenting, Matt. I'm going to ignore the fact that you didn't take the time to define what you meant by information and infer from what you said that you meant the number and frequency of alleles in the parental lupine population. Firstly, what do you mean by downhill? What criteria do you use to claim that a poodle is somehow worse than a wolf, Matt? I guarantee that you won't find one that doesn't require logical contortions that would qualify you as an act in Cirque du Soleil, because at the end of the day a poodle is just different from a wolf in the same way that most humans are just different from chimpanzees. Secondly, domestic dogs are still wolves in the same way as humans are still apes, apes are still primates, primates are still eutherians, and eutherians are still mammals. In this respect, the majority of the original lupine alleles are still present in the clade. Just because poodles don't share the same alleles with wolves doesn't mean that those alleles have been lost. They're still present in wolves and distributed over the different breeds of dog alive today. Creationists keep making this mistake because no matter how many times they're told that it's populations, not individuals, that evolve, they continually seem to be unwilling or unable to understand it. This is exactly why shitwits like Kirk Cameron and his cuddle buddy Ray Comfort seem to think that it's reasonable to expect a new species of animal to pop out of its mother's private parts fully formed. Thirdly, in the broader context, these arguments always ignore the process of gene duplication that can be caused by errors in homologous recombination, retrotransposons, and chromosome duplication. These processes allow the mutation of one of the duplicated genes without loss of function and therefore the evolution of new sequences and new information. And if you think that the article on Creation Ministries International that claims to debunk this will help you, you might want to think again, Matt. I found 3 major lies in the first page alone, and the fact that it was written by a fucking psychologist should ring an alarm bell or two. Finally, even without the process of gene duplication, it's been demonstrated that in an in silico simulation of evolution, new information can and does evolve using just the principles of mutation and natural selection alone. In summary, Matt, this is the kind of argument that arises when you take for granted and blindly repeat someone else's opinion without researching it for yourself. If you don't do that and it turns out that your source was either mentally constipated, high on Jesus juice, or simply lying like a priest in a choir boy's changing room, then it'll do nothing but reflect badly on you.
But my video was addressing more the origin of life, or at least the origin of molecular machinery, which is similar to car engines.
Okay, this is where I came closest to deciding to break my promise about not insulting you. So Matt, if you were addressing more the origins of life, then why the fuck did you call your video Evolution is Stupid? And as for the origin of molecular machines, I refer you back to my previous video. The same principles all apply. I have to say that I've noticed and commented on this tactic before, and I find it particularly reprehensible. Creationists seem to have a penchant for conflating abiogenesis with evolution, presumably in the hope that our imperfect understanding of the former will rub off on our very deep understanding of the latter. This is perhaps the most dishonest thing you've done so far, Matt, and although I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you didn't do it deliberately, you really should be embarrassed at yourself.
It's a serious problem for your worldview, and when you don't admit it, but instead you just turn to ridicule and mockery and swearing, it says a lot more about you than you think it does. You can ridicule me all you want, but it won't change my mind. If you want to change my mind, you'll need to give me evidence.
It's not a serious problem, Matt, because I fill the gaps in my knowledge with I don't know and not God did it. Of course, you're perfectly free to do the latter as long as you don't claim that my lack of knowledge is proof of your assertion. As I said in my video, there are still plenty of gaps for theists to put their God, and the origin of life is one of them. If you ever decide to take that step though, Matt, I'd recommend that you perhaps choose one of the ones surrounding the Big Bang, because my suspicion is that the others will slowly start filling up sometime in the not too distant future. And as for my language, I turn to ridicule and swearing because I'm quite frankly sick and tired of the lies and dishonesty of creationists who continue putting up the same tired old arguments no matter how many times their mistakes have been pointed out to them. Quite frankly, my patience has fucking run out. And finally, my intention is certainly not to change your mind or that of anyone else that I address in my videos. You folks are way far too gone for mere reason to get through to you, and any change has to come from within yourselves. Instead, I settle for taking the piss out of your ludicrous ideas and pointing out your misrepresentations in the hope that this may prevent at least one or two innocents from being polluted by them.
Let's assume that computers do gain consciousness and become a sort of life form that can reproduce and write its own software. Would that convince you that computers can form naturally simply because they can reproduce and write their own software? I think you'll quickly realize that if a computer could do these things, this would be evidence of an amazing engineering feat. I say the same thing about living things. It's only logical. Please show me where I'm wrong in my thinking.
Your analogy fails on multiple levels, Matt, including logically. Just because theoretical man-made self-replicating computers were initially consciously designed says nothing about whether cells were. It's still an argument from ignorance. It also fails in the case of your computers because we would have evidence that they were designed by a consciousness because we would know who the original designers were. In the case of cells, we have no such evidence and therefore no a priori reason to make the assertion. If for some reason we'd lost this knowledge, the only thing we'd be justified in saying about the origin of computers pending the discovery of pertinent evidence would be we don't know. Anything else would be pure speculation. In fact, your analogy not only fails but also serves you extremely poorly because it highlights exactly how intellectually weak your position is. Let me explain. Let's say one day that all life on this fictional Earth goes extinct and all that's left are the computers. 2 spaceships arrive, one full of creationist aliens and one full of empirical rationalists. By your own logic, the creationists should immediately come to the conclusion that these computers were created by their divine being since something must have designed their complexity. The rationalists, on the other hand, might initially reserve judgment. Instead of taking the easy way out by explaining everything with their God and then smugly congratulating themselves for their deductive skills, they might begin studying the computers instead. Upon further investigation, they might realize that many of the computer components could be constructed using known physical processes. They may even be able to duplicate some of these processes themselves, perhaps even start building their own simpler versions. Any of this sounding familiar, Matt? In this scenario, and with our a posteriori knowledge, we see that the rationalists have a chance of discovering that these computers have a natural explanation, while the creationists, satisfied with putting it all down to the supernatural and settling for spending the rest of their time basking in their certain truth and indulging in their mutual mental masturbation, explain everything by being 100% wrong. So how do you know that this isn't exactly what you and your fellow creationists are doing right now, Matt? I mean, really know. If you looked at it honestly for just a moment, if you opened up yourself to the possibility that you might be wrong, you might just be able to look at the evidence with an open mind and realize that you don't have a leg to stand on. So for the last time, Matt, the science that you're actively denying like a child who doesn't want to give up their favorite toy does not and cannot deny the existence of gods. It just places limits on the claims humans can make about how they created the universe and life on Earth. The world is full of theists in general and Christians specifically who found a way to integrate their God into reality, so it is possible, and some of them are even subscribed to me and support my goals here on YouTube. And if you can't do that, Matt, if you can't pull your mind out of the dark ages, if you can't reconcile your beliefs with reality, if you continue denying the undeniable with no regard to the evidence, then you're doomed to remain a laughingstock to everyone other than the rapidly shrinking group of anachronistic misfits that think the same way you do, until one day you'll find yourself all alone.